It basically means that there should be no bullying of one nation by another nation. We are all equal. A country's geographical location or income level or army determines who has a voice and who is spoken down to. And it basically means that there should be no bullying of one nation by another nation. We are all equal.
The Republic of Congo has filed lawsuits against Apple subsidiaries in France and Belgium, accusing the company of using, quote, pillaged minerals from the country in its products. The iPhone maker has denied the claim, saying it's committed to sourcing raw materials, responsibly. Let's get more.
Africa just did something no one thought was possible. And Apple is feeling the shockwave. For years, U.S. tech companies operated across Africa with almost zero resistance, dominating markets, collecting profits, and shaping the digital future of the continent. But tonight, everything changes. A new African trade move has hit the U.S. tech sector harder than anyone expected, and Apple, yes, Apple, is suddenly facing the most dangerous crisis in its history. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a decisive blow, one that signals a massive shift in global power. Africa has decided it will no longer be the playground of foreign tech giants. It will no longer watch billions leave the continent while its own industries struggle to grow. And this bold move, this unexpected strike, has caught Washington completely off guard. Apple's supply lines are shaking, its profits are at risk, its global dominance is now being challenged from a place the company underestimated for decades. The question isn't just why Africa went hard on U.S. tech. The real mystery is what comes next. Is this the beginning of Africa's rise as a global tech superpower? Or the start of a crisis America can't control? Let's break the full story down. Africa has done something bold, something that has sent shockwaves through the entire global technology industry. For decades, U.S. tech giants moved across the continent almost unchallenged, building influence, expanding markets, and extracting billions in revenue without facing any serious resistance. But now the ground has shifted. A new African policy move, coordinated by several nations and backed by rising continental alliances, has created the biggest disruption U.S. tech has ever seen on African soil. And at the center of this storm is Apple, the crown jewel of American innovation. For the first time in its modern history, Apple is staring at a crisis created not by China, not by Europe, not by American regulators, but by Africa itself. To understand the magnitude of what has happened, we must first understand what Africa represents. To Apple. For many people in the West, Africa is seen as a faraway market, smaller, less wealthy, and not strategically important. But that perception is outdated, dangerously outdated. Africa is the youngest continent in the world, home to over 1 billion people and rapidly approaching a population of 1.7 billion by 2050. It is the next global battlefield for technology dominance. American companies know it, Chinese companies know it, European companies know it, and Apple, despite its confidence, underestimated just how quickly Africa is changing. Over the past decade, Africa has become Apple's fastest-growing emerging market. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Ghana have seen explosive demand for iPhones, MacBooks, and Apple services. Even though Apple products are expensive, African youth see them as tools of aspiration, status, and entry into global digital culture. Apple's ecosystem, iOS, iCloud, Apple Music, App Store, has been quietly capturing millions of users. Behind the scenes, Apple has been earning billions from app purchases, ads, subscriptions, and hardware imports. But here's the twist. While Apple has been earning heavily from Africa, its investment into the continent has been minimal. Unlike China, where Apple builds factories. Unlike India, where Apple employs thousands. Unlike Europe, where Apple has data centers. Africa receives little more than retail outlets and service centers. This imbalance, big profits leaving Africa, little investment returning, became the foundation of Africa's resistance. Governments began studying the numbers, analyzing the trade flows, calculating the profits, and asking a simple but powerful question. Why should foreign tech giants extract billions from Africa without contributing to African digital development? That question led to discussions, the discussions led to strategy, and the strategy led to the bold move that has now changed everything. Africa has gone hard on U.S. tech. Several African nations, backed by new continental digital policies, have introduced fresh tariffs and regulatory hits directly targeting American tech giants. These tariffs are not small. They restructure how Apple operates on the continent, how it prices its products, how it pays taxes, and how it engages with Africa's rising tech ecosystem. Apple is being forced into a position it has always avoided: direct investment in African digital infrastructure or face severe penalties. The new tariffs strike Apple in three critical areas: hardware imports, software ecosystem profits, and data processing compliance. African governments have declared that any tech company that earns more than a certain threshold from the continent must reinvest a percentage of those profits into approved local industries: manufacturing, education, software development, and digital infrastructure. The idea is simple but revolutionary. Tech giants cannot just make money from Africa. They must help Africa grow. Apple, with some of the highest hardware prices in the world, is facing the toughest impact. Import tariffs in certain African markets have jumped sharply, making iPhones significantly more expensive. In some countries, the price of an iPhone is now equal to 6 months of minimum wage. African consumers are already pushing back, turning to cheaper alternatives, mostly from Asia. Apple's market share in some regions is showing early signs of decline, and investors are raising alarm, but the real problem is not the hardware. The real problem is data. Africa's new digital sovereignty policies are forcing foreign tech companies to process African user data within Africa, not in offshore servers. This is a major blow to Apple's current structure. Apple stores much of its user data in centers located in the US and Europe. Building new data centers in Africa will cost billions. But if Apple refuses to comply, it risks losing access to millions of African users, something Wall Street analysts fear could become a global embarrassment. Washington is not taking this lightly. U.S. officials have expressed concern over Africa's new digital policies, arguing that they could interfere with free trade. But Africa is no longer backing down. The continent is tired of being the passive receiver of technology. African leaders are saying loud and clear that it is time for Africa to shape its own digital destiny, and this new tariff strike is proof that Africa is ready to challenge the giants. Apple is now sitting at a crossroads. The company faces its worst crisis in Africa because its current model simply doesn't fit the continent anymore. For the first time, Apple is being forced to choose between protecting its profit margins or cooperating with African governments who demand long-term investment. And while Apple hesitates, other global players are moving fast to fill the gap. China's tech giants are already celebrating. Huawei, Xiaomi, Tecno, Infinix, and Oppo have expanded aggressively across Africa. They offer cheaper smartphones, tailored features, better local partnerships, and far more willingness to invest in African manufacturing. Transsion, the parent company of Tecno and Infinix, has built factories in Ethiopia and Nigeria. Xiaomi is testing local assembly operations in Kenya. Huawei is deeply involved in Africa's telecom infrastructure. These companies understand that Africa is not just a market, it is the future. In contrast, Apple maintained a distance for too long, and now distance has become vulnerability. African youth who once saw Apple as the ultimate status symbol are slowly shifting toward brands that understand their needs better. Affordable devices, strong camera performance, long-lasting batteries, local language support, installment payment plans. Apple has not adapted, and Africa has noticed. The crisis deepened when Apple's service revenues came under scrutiny. African regulators discovered that Apple's App Store fees, as high as 30% on some purchases, were draining money from African developers and consumers. New laws are being drafted to cap foreign digital service fees at 10%. If this passes, Apple would lose billions in potential long-term App Store revenue. It's a blow Apple did not see coming. Behind closed doors, Apple executives are discussing emergency strategies. Should the company build a data center in Africa? Should it establish an assembly plant to reduce import tariffs? Should it partner with African universities to develop local talent? Every option requires billions of dollars investments Apple has resisted for years. But now resisting could be far more expensive. Meanwhile, African nations are gaining confidence. For the first time in history, Africa is negotiating from a position of strength. The continent is the world's final major growth frontier for smartphones, digital payments, cloud services, and mobile applications. Every global tech company wants access, but Africa is now creating rules that favor those who invest locally. Apple is being forced either to adapt or fade into irrelevance in one of the fastest growing markets on Earth. In Washington, politicians are framing Africa's move as part of a broader geopolitical shift. They argue that Africa's new policies align too closely with the global trend of digital sovereignty seen in China, India, Brazil, and Europe. The U.S. fears losing influence over Africa's digital future. Losing Apple's dominance would be more than an economic loss, it would be a symbolic loss of American soft power. The U.S.-Africa relationship, especially in tech, has entered a new chapter defined not by American leadership but by African independence. But one thing is clear, Africa's push is not about attacking America, it is about fairness, dignity, and control over its own technological future. For years, Africa has been the consumer of other people's innovations. Now the continent wants to be a producer. This is why the African Union's digital transformation strategy emphasizes data sovereignty, local manufacturing, digital education, and the creation of African tech giants. Africa wants a seat at the global table not as a guest but as a decision maker. Apple's crisis is a reflection of a broader reality. The world is changing. Africa is rising. Foreign companies can no longer treat the continent as a passive marketplace. Young Africans are building startups, coding software, launching digital banks, and creating platforms that solve local problems better than Silicon Valley can. The continent is no longer waiting for foreign companies to bring solutions. This moment is a turning point. Apple can decide to respect Africa's new digital vision and invest deeply in the continent. It can choose to build facilities, train talent, partner with governments, expand manufacturing, and become a true participant in Africa's growth. Or it can resist, complain, lobby Washington to intervene, and watch its influence crumble as competitors take over. But here's the truth. Africa has already made its decision. The new tariffs are not negotiable. The demand for investment is not negotiable. The era of one-sided profits is over. Apple must evolve or perish in this region. Executives at Apple are now realizing the magnitude of the mistake. They assumed Africa would remain dependent on foreign tech forever. They assumed African governments would never challenge them. They assumed African consumers would never leave the Apple ecosystem. But Africa is awake, assertive, confident, and determined to shape its own digital destiny. This is not just an economic story. It is a story about power, who has it, who wants it, and who is finally ready to take it. Africa's decision to go hard on US tech is a declaration of sovereignty, a declaration of equality, a declaration that Africa will no longer accept being a silent participant in the global economy. Apple's worst crisis in Africa is not about tariffs, not about money, and not even about market share. It is about the realization that Africa cannot be ignored anymore. The continent is forcing one of the world's most powerful companies to change course, and whether Apple likes it or not, this is the future. Africa is not pushing America away. Africa is demanding a fair relationship, one built on respect, investment, and shared growth. And if Apple can embrace this new reality, it may not only survive this crisis, it may emerge stronger. But if it hesitates, Africa is ready to move on without it. The world is watching. Tech giants are watching. Governments are watching. For the first time, Africa is setting the rules of engagement. Apple's crisis is not just a story of a company struggling in an unfamiliar environment. It is the story of a continent rising, claiming its power, and rewriting the global narrative. Africa has gone hard on US tech, and the future will never be the same again. This moment we are witnessing is bigger than Apple, bigger than technology, and bigger than tariffs. It is the story of a continent that has decided to stand tall after decades of being underestimated, overlooked, and treated as an afterthought by global powers. Africa's decision to go hard on US tech is not an attack, it is a declaration. A declaration that Africa will no longer sit quietly on the sidelines while others shape its future. A declaration that the youngest, fastest-growing population on Earth deserves more than imported ideas, imported devices, and imported policies. Africa wants a future built by African hands, powered by African minds, and guided by African priorities. For too long, foreign corporations saw Africa as a goldmine of consumers, millions of young people hungry for technology, entertainment, and status. And yes, Africans embraced that global culture. They bought the devices, they downloaded the apps, they subscribed to the platforms. But beneath that surface, something deeper was happening. A new generation began to ask important questions. Why are we only consumers? Why are we not producers? Why do we pay top dollar for technology that isn't built for our realities? Why do billions leave Africa every year while so little comes back? Today's crisis is the answer to those questions. Africa is no longer willing to accept imbalanced partnerships. The new tariffs, regulations, and digital sovereignty policies are Africa's way of saying, we matter, our markets matter, our people matter. And if you want access to our continent, you must contribute to our growth. It is a message sent not just to America, but to every global player who sees Africa as a marketplace instead of a partner. Apple, for all its brilliance and innovation, made one critical mistake. It assumed Africa would stay the same forever. It assumed the continent would always prioritize the Apple brand over its own development. But Africa has changed. Young Africans are building companies, coding apps, designing systems, and pushing for digital independence. They are no longer waiting for Silicon Valley to save them. They are building their own silicon savannas, their own tech hubs, their own digital revolutions. And now the entire world must adjust. But make no mistake, this crisis is not the end of Apple in Africa. It is a new beginning. It is a chance for one of the world's most powerful companies to rethink its role on the continent. Does Apple want to be a distant giant that only collects revenue? Or does it want to be a true partner that invests in Africa's growth? The continent has opened a door, not closed one. Apple has a choice, and whatever choice it makes will determine its future not just in Africa but across the emerging world. Because Africa is becoming a global trendsetter, its decisions influence how India negotiates with tech giants, how Brazil sets its digital laws, how Southeast Asia protects its data. Africa is no longer reacting to global policies, it is shaping them. And that is what terrifies some powers and excites others. The continent that once had no voice in global technology now speaks with authority. And when Africa speaks, the world listens. As we close this story, remember one thing. Africa is not rising, Africa has risen. The tariffs, the regulations, the bold moves. They are signs of a continent rewriting its destiny. A continent looking at companies like Apple and saying, if you want to be part of our future, then you must help build it. This is not the end of American influence. It is the end of unchecked influence. It is the beginning of respect, negotiation, partnership, and equality. Apple is facing its worst crisis ever in Africa, but crises create transformation. And in that transformation, there is opportunity, and opportunity for Africa to grow stronger and for Apple to redefine its relationship with the continent. The world is watching a seismic shift in global power. Africa has stepped forward, unafraid, unshakable, and unapologetic. The question now is simple: will the rest of the world adapt to Africa's new reality or be left behind by it? Because Africa's message is clear: this is our time, our market, our data, our rules, our future. And from this moment onward, Africa will be the one setting the terms. The crisis is just the beginning. The new era has already arrived.